So I think is Sharon the chair of your committee?
She is, as she is in the computer science department.
So I think we will turn the floor over to Sharon, who will take over.
Okay, I actually didn't expect that, but I think I can do this. So hello everyone, welcome to David's defense, and thank you for coming for joining us today. And I guess yeah, we can get started. David, you can take it away.
Excellent. I just want to thank everybody for coming today. It really means a lot to see all of these very familiar faces today as I defend 6 years of work that I am titling Learning Mobile Manipulation. And I'd like to start off by showing a robot in a house. This robot has a goal in mind. It wants to pick up an object without ever localizing itself within the environment. We want to be able to get to the object, isolate its geometry from the environment, and then plan a next best view around this object so we can refine our understanding of it. Once we have a next best view in mind, we need to reconstruct the nearby geometry of the environment that the robot is currently in and calculate a new image goal relative to the current position of the robot so that it can navigate around without localization, capture a second view, and then with this second view, reconstruct the object better and pick it up, which it will do very shortly. There you go. Picking it up, weird path, excellent. And so mobile manipulation is a very challenging problem, as I'm sure many of you know. Previous work has relied on heuristic and rule-based strategies to solve this, but we can use big data, deep learning, and simulation to improve this, allowing a robot to navigate to objects and understand them without localizing it or without knowing the objects beforehand. The method I'm about to propose is best in terms of success weighted by path length and reconstruction quality, is able to capture multiple views of the object without ever registering them between each other. And I introduce a novel next best view method for reconstruction. A recent work on the review of challenges in mobile manipulation looked at how we could develop a series of tests for different mobile manipulation pipelines. These platforms are not limited to industry, but are supportive in various fields such as service, assistance, teleoperation, and also rehabilitation. Due to the operation of such increasingly complex systems in less structured and dynamic environments, often in close contact with humans, more demanding challenges evolve in terms of systems design, control, and sensors. This is all a very fancy way of saying this is a really hard problem that is really relevant to a lot of different fields. Recent work was looking at how we could potentially solve mobile manipulation by semantically relating objects to its environment. For example, recognizing that there is a Coke can inside of the box. It's trying to do object recognition with knowing these objects beforehand to recognize the pose of the object on the surface, and uses a belief network to find inter-object relationships and a scene graph to plan tasks using these different objects. It utilizes semantic information for labeling these objects, which is just a fancy way of saying it can look at a scene and recognize that this is a Coke can, recognize that this is something pick-upable or that it's an obstacle in the environment. But it uses SLAM for navigation, and this means that it requires knowing where the robot is in its environment at runtime, and it doesn't consider novel objects. And I want to address that today by proposing a general archetype for mobile manipulation, starting with locomoting the agent throughout its environment, where it can get to an object or get to a task of interest. It then acquires data about its nearby environment so that it can plan some type of manipulation task. It can then choose to refine its understanding by going back and locomoting again to capture another view, maybe acquire some more data. And when it's confident enough, it can finally plan a manipulation task on the object. And what this might look like using some sample data from simulation is we have a goal object, in this case a mustard container, and a panoramic target goal, which is a series of 8 images of the environment that we want the robot to navigate to. We take that and use a novel visual navigation system that's able to use this panoramic target goal as well as images of its current view to navigate to regions of interest. It then isolates the object geometry, collects visual tactile information or potentially other views, is able to perform a reconstruction of this object, and then manipulate the object using this reconstruction. But we might want to leverage multiple views instead of tactile information. And so we do that by navigating, again, isolating the object geometry, performing an initial reconstruction, and selecting voxels that maybe we're uncertain about in that reconstruction. Predicting a panorama at the goal location for the next best view and navigating to that position. Performing a two-view reconstruction of the object and then manipulating it just as before. And so I'm proposing these two different systems, one using visual tactile, one using two views, to move around the environment and manipulate objects. And I want to first start off by highlighting how would we create such a navigation system. And so a work in 2020 with me and collaborators was looking at how we can train agents to navigate through their environment using a series of different trajectories. The key ideas of this system are that it only uses RGBD information, and that's a fancy way of saying color and depth information. It's able to use panoramic targets to navigate to regions of interest, which is 8 images taken in a circle. It uses real-world data and photorealistic rendering to train this, so these are all real environments scanned and used in simulation to capture images. And we use imitation learning to train these agents to navigate around using expert trajectories generated in simulation. And so there's two major data sets that we want to use for this. One is the Matterport 3D data set, which is a series of real-world homes scanned, and using semantic labels, we can understand what are obstacles and what are not. And additionally, there's the Stanford 2D 3DS data set, which are very large campus-wide buildings in the Stanford campus, all scanned. And both of these are meshes that we can place virtual cameras, virtual robots in, and navigate around. And so the simulator I'm using is called Gibson. And what it does is it allows me to have an active agent in a very large space, capture color information as if there was a camera in that space, and collect some additional channels. In this case, I'm only really concerned with depth and color information. And we can see here that the robot starts moving around, navigating through, and we're simulating what the robot might be experiencing by bumping into walls, colliding with the floor, and what the camera does in response to that. And so we can get some very good images that way. This is a top-down view of a fetch robot navigating through one of the environments in the Stanford dataset. And this is what we use to train this agent. It's a series of different positions of the robotic agent and images captured along the way that we want to turn into a policy to navigate through. And so we have lots of these different trajectories. So green is the goal, red are the different waypoints along the way, and blue is the start position for each of these different trajectories. And so we have 7,000 trajectories for simpler environments, 5,000 for a medium-sized environment, and 3,000 as the environmental complexity increases, because as you can imagine, these trajectories get much longer. And so they're seeing comparable amount of data. And so this is the input into the system. Panoramic target goal, 4 previous images in the current view. All of these are passed through what's called an autoencoder, which is trained on reconstructing each of these individual images. And then through this, we get a dense embedding that we can then use to train other models without gradient decay. With this embedding, we can then pass a dense embedding representation of the panoramic target goal in the current view through a goal checker. What the goal checker is doing is assessing, are we done yet? With a confidence of 0 and 1. We can then use this multi-layer perceptron to determine that using the 8 image panoramic goal embeddings and the current embedding. If the value is above a certain threshold, we want to make sure that we're actually done. And so what it will do is what I call a victory lap, where it will spin in place and assess whether it's really done. If we're not done, we want to pass it into a policy. And the policy is actually going to determine whether we want to move forward, right, or left. And this is again done using a fully connected layer that goes down into 3 different actions, otherwise known as a classifier. The policy model will output these based on the input data shown before. With certain confidence values between 0 and 1 of each action, we pick the highest, most confident action to take. We then execute that in the environment, and this whole system works in concert together to have this agent actually move through the environment. And so in the bottom left, we can see a top-down view of the fetch robot navigating to it, followed by that victory lap I talked about, where it really assesses whether it's done. And so we can see that this agent can actually navigate to unseen targets. So this panoramic target goal was not seen during training, and it's able to navigate through the environment while avoiding walls, obstacles, and getting there with relative ease and also expedient. It's not wasting a lot of time navigating to the wrong place. But in some cases, we have actually observed that the agent doesn't get to the goal in a timely manner. In fact, will make a mistake. And so we noticed, even though the agent wasn't trained for this, that it's able to exhibit recovery behavior. And so you'll see the agent turn left here erroneously into the hallway, but turn around when it realizes that the goal is in a different direction. And this is a very interesting property that we were able to notice given the architecture we designed. And it will successfully get to the goal location. We want to compare this agent against a state-of-the-art system, and so we chose a Siamese actor-critic model, which is trained using reinforcement learning. And that's a fancy way of saying that it's using an actor model, which is a policy, and a critic model to evaluate the performance of a goal that may be poorly defined. We translated the agent to work in these real-world environments in simulation. It relies on an idealized GPS. It's not using a goal checker the same way we are. It's using images to navigate, but it is using a point goal of the relative position of the goal location and the agent itself. It's trained on 26 rooms, but we made sure to train it in the environments provided using a comparable amount of training data. But it doesn't allow for those color-based goals, as I mentioned, and it's not designed with manipulation in mind. And so I have 3 baseline comparison hours with the goal checker that I proposed. The idealized version, where we replace the goal checker with the absolute position of the object and the robot at runtime, and the Siamese actor-critic model that I mentioned. The experimental setup is we tested 400 holdout trajectories in each environment. Holdout meaning these were unseen goal locations. We tested ours, the idealized, and the Siamese actor-critic model. And when a collision occurred, the trial was done. And so we can see in this example, this is the House 2 environment in Matterport 3D, that ours was able to navigate to the goal location with 98%, and the Siamese actor-critic model often got lost in multi-room environments. As the environmental complexity increased, we noticed that our success rate decreased, but we noticed that the reinforcement learned model decreased even more substantially than that. And even in the very large environments, we were able to find that our agent was able to navigate to the goal location. It's very tiny there, and that might not be great on Zoom, but there is a robot navigating to the goal location, I swear. We used a metric called success weighted by path length, and that is just a nice way of averaging out the observed length of the path with the optimal length of the path. Optimal being a generous word in this case. It was an expert trajectory planned using Dijkstra's algorithm, using a 2D map of the environment. And so each of these averages are then multiplied by the binary success of navigating to the goal location, and we get a value where higher is better. And what we see is for success rate, as the environmental complexity increases, we notice that it decreases, as mentioned before. But our performance with the learned goal checker is comparable to the performance of the idealized model. And this was something we were really looking for. If the goal checker was perfect, how much better performance could we expect? And we see that also with SPL, that the success weighted by path length of the Siamese actor-critic model is actually much, much higher than ours, where ours was around 2.5 and theirs was about 3.5, about 4, which means it was roughly, when it was successful, 4 times longer to navigate to certain locations. And so this is great. We were able to navigate to regions of interest, but how do we maybe consider this working in other contexts, like Minecraft? And
David, sorry, just a quick clarification. Can you go back for a second? So
Sure.
For success weighted by path length, so higher is better here?
You know what, I'm realizing that this might be the wrong chart. I think I have, this one is correct. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
I think I'm using values copied incorrectly from my thesis. Just realized.
Got it. Now it makes sense. Okay.
Yes. So ours with the idealized model is best, and then ours with the learned goal checker is second best. That makes more sense. All right. So, as I mentioned, we can translate this into Minecraft, and that's really interesting because why Minecraft? Well, Minecraft lends itself well to poorly defined tasks that we want to have neural network agents learn. And so there was a competition last year called the MineRL Basalt competition, which gave a suite of 4 different tasks. One was finding a cave, one was making a waterfall, one was creating an animal pen and trapping an animal in there, and one was building a house in the style of the environment. And we were given 40 to 80 different human demonstrations for each of these tasks, which were a series of images and the actions taken at each image. And we were told, go train something using limited training time, and you can only provide 30 megabytes of extra data. And so this is the solution we came up with, where we have a picture of the environment coming in, we classify the state of that picture, we use the human labeled data from the human demonstrations to train that state classifier. We then have a state machine that's determining which particular engineered or learned subtask we want to use. And then we can use behavioral cloning in most of those cases for exploration. This is very similar to the model I showed before using learned navigation, where for the environment we have these images coming in. We then have a goal checker or a state classifier determining if we're done. We have a policy model that's using behavioral cloning based on some kind of expert trajectory to determine how to move around the environment. And this kind of flexibility actually let us win first place in the competition, which we were very excited about. The competition was evaluated by human judges. We had, in our own testing, had a hybrid agent, which is the one I just talked about, compared versus a purely engineered or manually selected policy model, a learned agent, which was just using behavioral cloning, and human data. And we wanted to see which was performing best. And so we found that overall our hybrid agent was second best, and we were actually first best performing in waterfall tasks. And so here on the right, you can see an agent actually constructing that waterfall, turning around and taking a picture of it. So this is where we're at. We have an agent that was trained to navigate around its environment, but we want to actually incorporate information about the object so we can plan a manipulation task. This is mobile manipulation after all. And so the first solution I want to talk about for that is visual tactile shape understanding. Work from Varley et al. Was looking at how to take single images of objects and reconstruct them into meshes to do grass planning. And so in H, we can see the Barrett hand in simulation planning a grasp on that shoe, reconstructed. We then, in that paper, they used a 40 cubed voxel grid input to reconstruct a 40 cubed voxel grid output. What we found in our work is that we're able to use the same exact architecture where we concatenate the information coming from a depth camera and information coming from a tactile hand into a single point cloud, voxelize that, pass that through the exact same model trained on this kind of data to perform better object hypotheses than if we just use a single image alone. To train this, we used simulated data captured from the YCB object dataset and GRASP dataset, which are just good datasets for doing object reconstruction training. To capture the tactile samples, it was very complicated to organize a Barrett hand in simulation to simulate tactile collection. Is really not a solved problem. So what we did is we randomly sampled positions in the included side of the object, as well as synthetically rendered objects, and aligned the ground truth voxel expectation of the output with the simulated captured data. And so what that might look like is shown here, where red is the depth information captured from the synthetic rendering, blue are the tactile positions, and green is the ground truth that we want the model to output. How we might capture this in the real world is we have a Connect camera up there on the left and a Barrett hand coming in to tap the occluded side of the object here, where we capture in red the depth information, and in blue the tactile. And so we're able to actually perform better completions. In the top row, we see that the Rubbermaid container using tactile in depth was able to capture a handle that wasn't present in the depth-only version. And in the case of a rubber duck, which neither of these were seen at train time, by the way, we were able to complete the rest of the duck even using just very sparse tactile information. We had several different live experiments using different objects. And what we found is using just a little bit of tactile information was able to fill in the back half of many objects where other methods that were either algorithmic or heuristic in nature were unable to get good completions. Ours is shown in red in this box here. And so we had 4 different metrics for evaluating the performance of this model. We had Jacquard, which was mean intersection over union. It's just checking how many of these voxels overlap with the intended reconstruction. Hausdorff distance, which is measuring the distance between a mesh and the ground truth mesh. The simulated grasp joint error was taking a Barrett hand and grasp it, planning a grasp using the the reconstructed object, and then trying to execute that same grasp on a ground truth version of the mesh and seeing how different the joints were between what was expected. And also lift success, which was a real-world experiment evaluating whether we could lift the object. And so there are a lot of tables here, lots of data. What I want to highlight is that for all of these different metrics, we found that incorporating just a little bit of tactile information really improved the reconstruction quality in terms of Jacquard, in terms of lift success, in terms of grasp joint error, and in terms of Hausdorff. Most importantly, the depth and tactile method was 87.5% successful at lifting the object versus 75% for just a single view alone. And so this is the picture of where we're at. We are able to navigate through the environment, understand object geometry, and manipulate it. But what if we wanted to incorporate multiple views? We have a mobile base, we have a camera. Let's capture a second view of the object and figure out how we want to do that. And I want to first talk about how we would implement a 2-view reconstruction method without having to localize the views of the objects at runtime, because that localization problem is not something we want to worry about. And so in this example, we have a Rubbermaid pitcher sitting on a table with a current view of the Rubbermaid container missing a handle and the previous view having that handle information. And using this, we can actually reconstruct the object better without having these images outside of their image frame. Both of these are in the same frame relative to each other. This is the picture I showed you before. This is what we used for visual tactile reconstruction. For this work, I expanded out that decoder so that it's using a series of deconvolutional layers, which can offer potentially better performance. And then I broke that encoder into 2 different channels, one for the previous view and one for the current view. And I take the dense embedding coming out of both of those, add them together, and then I do another fully connected layer to then pass through the decoder to reconstruct the object. All of this allows us to reconstruct objects without having to worry about registering them together in the same channel input like we did with the visual tactile reconstruction. To train this, I used the same YCB object and grasp dataset I used before. And then I introduce a challenge dataset, which is 20 unique models taken from ShapeNet that have self-occluding properties or are very difficult to reconstruct due to their strange geometry. The training data might have looked like this, where we have an initial view of the object, we have a secondary view maybe taken beforehand, and we have the ground truth of the object kept in the same frame as the first view, because we want to be reconstructing the objects in what we're currently looking at. Some example reconstructions are shown here, where on the right-hand side, that is the ground truth. And in the middle, we can see that the 2 views was actually able to, in many cases, reconstruct the back half of the object correctly and understand how far back the object is supposed to go. And in the case of the drill, was able to more accurately measure how big the handle was, shown here. To evaluate this, what you might want to do is an ablation study and figure out what is really important to enabling this kind of behavior. And so we have several different models that we evaluated, the most important of which is the 2-view split comb, and that's what I'm proposing today, shown in this 3rd row here. There are a lot of different reconstructions I could show you, but I just really want to highlight how much more similar this is to the ground truth, especially in the case of the challenge objects. We use 3 different evaluation metrics. They're the same ones as before, except lift success, because we didn't run real-world experiments. And for the ablation study results, we find that our 2-view split conv method is the best performing model, showing that each of the different aspects we chose of this particular design were critical to enabling this performance. So this is where we're at right now. We have the ability to do 2-view reconstruction. But what this doesn't let us do is figure out what view we want to capture next. And so I'm proposing a next best view planning method. And then once we have that next best view, how do we navigate to it? And so there is another proposal for a learn to local navigation method, and I'm going to talk about both of those now. So this picture again, we're going to first talk about the next best view planning method. There are many different next best view methods, and they have been worked on for a very long time, including work from members of my committee on this particular problem. I want to highlight one of these particular solutions that came out in 2017 that's recognizing objects based on an initial object candidate, and it's recognizing these objects, it's not reconstructing them. So it's not handling novel object geometry. It's also using a cylindrical model, which doesn't really lend itself well to a robot that can raise and lift its torso and potentially capture other views by angling its head up and down. Additionally, it requires localization to capture that next best view, and I really want to be able to reuse this learned local navigation system from before. And so we can leverage the uncertainty that comes out of a single view reconstruction to plan a next best view by selecting voxels that maybe are close to the decision boundary. And so what this might look like is we first get a partial point cloud of the object segmented from the environment. We use a single view CNN to reconstruct the object geometry. We select voxels that are close to this decision boundary. And then what we do is we use principal component analysis on all of these voxels to find the smallest component to capture as many of them in a next best view as possible. We calculate these voxels close to the decision boundary. We performed some testing and found 0.025 to be a good thresholding for these kinds of voxels. And we compute the principal component analysis on these using the formula shown here. Most importantly is capturing this vector next best view, VNBV. Many of you might be wondering why not just capture the opposite view, and it's a fair point. In some cases though, capturing the opposite view is not using intelligent information about the single view reconstruction. And so in the case of the pitcher, just using the opposite view, we didn't reconstruct the handle. And in the case of the Windex bottle, it actually ended up confusing itself more. And in the case of the power drill, we actually got a much better reconstruction, properly figuring out the bounds of the object. And so how we would implement this is the view is extrapolated to an XY coordinate relative to the current position of the robot. We then calculate the angle that we want the head to align itself well with to capture the next best view. And this angle is used later when we arrive at the next best view location. And so now we're going to talk about how do we navigate to that next best view. We use a panoramic prediction method, and I alluded to this in the beginning of the presentation, where we plan a nearby view to navigate based on the next best view. We capture the nearby environment and predict a panorama at the target location, and we can do that by rendering 8 views in simulation of that target location. And we can then reuse the learned local navigation system to navigate to this predicted position. So this environment is the House 1 environment in Matterport 3D. We can place a robot in it, take a series of images in a circle around itself, and reconstruct a mesh of its nearby environment. There will be holes in this mesh, but there are holes in the training data we use to train the agent for navigating through the environment. And so even though there are holes, it's a close enough re-rendering of the environment that the ground truth prediction, the ground truth panorama, which is the panorama I would have captured, is very similar to the predicted panorama. Once we do that, we navigate around the object to capture the next best view, and then we finally manipulate the object. In order to evaluate this, we broke it up into several different tests. The first was doing shape reconstruction. Similar to before, we have Jacquard, Hausdorff, and Grasp joint error. We tested specifically on the YCB and Grasp data set to evaluate performance, and it was, in fact, the best. For the next best view of the challenge data set, we actually noticed better performance because in this case, the objects, due to their self-occluding properties, lend themselves better to a next best view rather than some kind of opposite view where the same occlusions might appear on the other side. For evaluating the performance of the predicted panorama navigation, we evaluated the SPL and success rate of a Ross navigation method with the ground truth map, the true panorama at the goal location, and the predicted panorama. And we find that ours performs favorably when compared to these two baseline methods. We also introduce a new metric, end-to-end SPL, and what that's doing is it's changing the way we evaluate that success, the binary success from normal SPL, where instead it's whether or not it lifted the object. And we're also considering the different actions it took to do the local navigation in addition to the long-range navigation. And what we find is that our method performs favorably when compared to methods that have access to the ground truth map at runtime. And so this is where we're at. We have the ability to navigate around an environment, understand object geometry, plan other views, and get better reconstructions for manipulation. But what if we want to be able to use multiple views? And so while we're navigating around, we might see more views of the object. And so some preliminary work I'm working on proposes a multiple view shape understanding method using performers. We don't have a lot of time today. I see we're running short, so I'm going to briefly talk about this where we use multiple partial views of the object using attention models to get better and better understandings of the object as we capture incremental views panning over the object geometry to finally get a very accurate version of the drill. And so this picture again, we have a full mobile manipulation pipeline. What I've proposed today is an agent that's able to navigate to unseen targets using novel 8-image panoramic goals. The agent does not need access to its global position and in fact performs 44% better than a method that had access to the point goal at runtime. I proposed a framework to efficiently generate optimal trajectories using the Gibson simulator using 3D scans of the environment, as well as a novel methodology for discretizing these continuous trajectories into a series of forward, right, and left commands. The visual tactile method had these contributions, a framework for integrating the visual tactile sensory data to better reason about the geometry for robotic manipulation, as well as an open source data set for training these kinds of systems in the future. Real and simulated grasping experiments showing the reconstruction quality improvement, as well as methods for evaluating these kinds of agents in the future. For the two-view reconstruction method, we saw how to build a framework for integrating two images of an object kept in their respective image frames to reason about object geometry better. An open source data set of these two different views to build better systems in the future, a series of ablations to evaluate the performance of the two-view shape completion quality, showing that the reconstruction quality of this proposed method is the best in the ablation, as well as a challenge data set of objects to be used for future research. And finally, the full pipeline is a novel algorithm that uses the current view of the object as well as uncertainty to determine the next best view for object reconstruction, and a novel panoramic prediction method to navigate to the next best view without localizing the agent in its environment. I proposed a novel end-to-end SPL metric to measure the performance of mobile manipulation systems in general, as well as showed experiments that demonstrated our learned method performs favorably against methods that have access to the full map at runtime. As you can imagine, with work like this, there are lots of potential future directions, and so I'm going to highlight a few of these. First of which is extension to unseen environments. Right now, this particular methodology requires knowing the map of the environment to train it in at runtime, at train time. I believe that in many cases these kinds of environments have lots of similarities between each other, and we may be able to leverage semantic information about the environment in order to plan navigation tasks around. Additionally, we can use implicit representations of objects. Recent work such as neural radiance fields is showing very promising results in object and scene reconstruction for novel views of objects. And so I believe using these kinds of implicit representations may lend themselves better for grasp planning in the future. An uncertainty-based grasp planning method, all of the work shown here uses GraspIt to do grasp planning, using volume quality, which is a convex hull on the force contacts of the object, of the fingertips to the object. And I believe we could potentially leverage the uncertainty of the object to better inform how we might want to place the fingers for a particular grasp, and potentially still use some of the optimization strategies that are present in GraspIt. Finally, I would like to talk about a learned next best view method that's able to predict how much better the next best view is going to be. Right now we're using principal component analysis, which is an algorithmic approach. But it would be good to have some kind of quality metric that's evaluating how good the reconstruction we have right now is and how much better it might be with that next best view. In some cases, we found that the single view was in fact enough. And so having some kind of oracle to determine that that is the case at runtime would be very useful. All of the work is in the following publications, which you are free to look at. My work is funded by NSF, as well as the Army Research Laboratory. And I would like to thank all of the wonderful people who helped me get here today. I really could not have done this without all of you. And I want to especially thank my advisor, who has helped me over the past 6 years, encouraging me to get lots of results and have lots of good demonstrations. And I have learned an immense amount of information from all of these people. Thank you all so much. And I can take questions now.
Yeah, I think now is the phase that public can ask questions. Any questions for David?
I have a question. First of all, thanks a lot for the talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned one of the future directions being leveraging uncertainty to determine next views. So I was just curious if you think a possible extension could be leveraging uncertainty to decide, to trade off between how much time it takes to reconstruct the object and your confidence that you'd be able to robustly grasp it.
Absolutely. One of the future directions I wanted to incorporate was reachability, and that exactly takes that into account. Is if I navigate to this next best view, if I navigate to the next best view, I want to make sure that I can actually pick up the object of interest, as well as how much longer is it going to take me to reconstruct, replan a manipulation task relative to now. I think it's an absolute no-brainer next extension of this work, very low-hanging fruit. Thank you for your question.
Thanks.
David, yeah, very good presentation. Kind of, yeah, follow on along these lines, you know, like, maybe you consider like objects that aren't just in the center of a room where a robot can easily navigate around it, right? Or, you know, like a cluttered table with a bunch of different objects, like stepping as a, you know, move into more, you know, how would you try to take that into a more like complicated and cluttered environment, right?
Absolutely. It's something I've thought about a lot. And so the two different directions I have for that, one is to potentially increase the resolution from 40 cubed to something like 128 cubed. Right now, the just 40 cubed voxel resolution doesn't lend itself well to scenes. And so having a higher resolution reconstruction will allow us to use that training data. For doing, additionally, the implicit representations could allow us to get sort of an arbitrary resolution of a particular environment. And so what we might want to look at is reconstructing entire scenes using implicit representations.
Got it. And then I was wondering, have you ever considered, is it you showed a nice progression of the story, which is great, and you showed the work from when you were combining tactile and visual information, and then going to the multi-view.
Mm-hmm.
But what about continuing on that multimodal trend with the multi-view work with tactile information, right? So like tactile reconstruction with this multiple next best view.
Absolutely. I think in the case, a lot of this was simulated. And so it made it very difficult to collect synthetic tactile information in sort of a nice, easy to reproduce way. So I think in order for that to really take place, we would need to have a very good way of synthetically generating lots of these tactile observations, but they can be passed into the network exactly the same way as the multiple view data is, kept in maybe the image frame of the environment, where we could train it to maybe keep it in some kind of fixed frame relative to the wrist of the robot's end effector, so that we don't really have to register these views between each other as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. Thank you for your question.
I see John has a question.
Yeah, great work, David.
Thanks, John.
It was really a pleasure to see your development from freshman all the way here. I mean, that's great. Had the following question. You talk about a little bit of tactile information goes a long way, and I was just wondering if you could maybe quantify or maybe just even qualitatively explain. Certainly if you have one single tactile voxel, that's worth a lot.
It is.
But about the second one or the 100th, and any idea how that utility curve changes as you add more points or ablate them away?
So what we found in our, at least qualitatively, is we had this 40 cubed voxel grid. And on the far end of the voxel grid, we would shoot these rays to calculate, is this a point of contact? And we shot 40 of those rays. So we're getting roughly, 25% of the back half of the voxel occupancy. But for many of these smaller objects, it would miss a lot of them. And so in some of these demonstrations, we had 3 points, 2 points, even 1 point, or even no tactile data. But having 1 point really did a lot. And in those demonstrations I showed, in those reconstructions, we had maybe 10 points that we were able to capture, because the Barrett hand has a very high threshold for when it will consider a valid tactile press. So in many cases, we would only get some of the tactiles illuminated, but one point was super important. 10 points, you would get a small bump in improvement. After that, it was kind of marginal, really. You were getting closer to a second camera view, and in that case as well, as you can imagine, it's not super relevant with all of them, all of the points.
So does this mean you really don't have to instrument a hand very much for tactile?
Not for this reconstruction, no.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions from the audience?
Hey, David. Yeah,
Hey,
thanks so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask about the holdout scheme. So I think you mentioned there are some goals, or it's being evaluated on goals that it has not seen at train time.
Yes.
But is that also true for the environments, or it could have seen other parts of the environment before?
Yes, it has seen these environments before, but it just has not seen those specific panoramic target goals.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
Okay. If that's all the questions, I think the next phase is community member are gonna ask questions. And then thanks again for everyone who attends this defense. And yeah, I guess now we will let you guys leave, and then we will ask questions to David.
Thank you all so much for attending.